Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Revolution 250. Excuse, hold on. Hello, well,
Yow, it's gotcha.
yeah, let me get some water.
Damn. So Jonathan, you can edit this. You can just kind of cut stuff out when the recording part is done.
Correct.
It's a nice part about not doing it live.
Yes, we've learned our lesson once or twice.
Yeah. Because I can see in the corner there it says live 18 minutes and counting. So
yeah.
It's tricky business to have a whole video setup studio in your house.
Yeah.
Have all these things taken care of with mics and angles and lighting and breathable throats. It gets tricky about this time of year.
It is, yeah. Okay, let's try it again.
Great.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Revolution 250 podcast. I'm Bob Allison. I chair the Rev 250 advisory group. I teach history at Suffolk University. And Revolution 250 is a collaboration among organizations looking at ways to commemorate the beginnings of the American Revolution. And our guest today is Daniel Bullen, who is a writer in Western Massachusetts. He's written a series of books, Love Lives of the Artists and The Dangers of Passion, about Emerson and Margaret Fuller and the Transcendentalists. And his new book we'll be talking about is Daniel Shays'sHonorable Rebellion, an American story about what's known as Daniel Shays' Rebellion. So Dan, thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me on.
And so what got you interested in Daniel Shays and the story of what happened in Western Mass in 1786, 1787?
Sure. So as I say in the preface, I found this story on the side of the road, literally. I was driving actually from Amherst up Route 202 over to Concord to go and try and hawk my Emerson book, my Emerson and Fuller and Transcendentalists book, and drove up the Daniel Shays Highway. Didn't know anything about Daniel Shays. I'm not a historian. I've got a background in literature. But I came home and looked him up. It was 2012. Bernie was, on the scene. Occupy was fairly recent. And the more I read about the story, the less I felt like the histories that were out there really did justice to this lived experience.
Mm-hmm.
So what I found throughout the process in the past 10 years before it finally got to print was that what's known as Shays' Rebellion, and I'm just going to ask all of the viewers to please use the quotes because it's a propaganda term, but the story of Shays' Rebellion as such was propaganda, before the Constitution. The angry farmers got angry about taxes, disrupted the government, and, showed the founding fathers that they needed a stronger, federal government. Basically, I think the subtext of that story was to protect against dangerous poor people when poor people start organizing. The story that I found was really much closer to the reality that that we still see today, which is regular people might need to organize when their government doesn't reflect their interests and doesn't take their interests into consideration. So once I could see that publishing this book became a lot easier once I could recognize the degree to which that other story was really entrenched, and then to be able to build that bridge for people to show that the Constitutional Convention was a movement that was already underway for starting in 1784. There were people saying these articles are not going to work. We need to change this, right? So what's known as Shays' Rebellion was really a convenient episode to put pressure on George Washington by specific actors. Henry Knox was leading the charge to try to get George Washington out of retirement to lead a constitutional convention. But there had been a convention in 1786. There had been a convention in 1785. There just weren't enough states. So this story, this mythology that we have of what's known as Shays' Rebellion became this convenient piece, and they're still getting it. You know, the Massachusetts, it's in the state framework. So the middle schoolers are all still getting this story today as the unrest that led to the Constitution, the angry farmers, yada, yada. Right?
Okay.
So telling this story was a way to get underneath that and find what I found was kind of a living experience.
Okay. So if they weren't angry farmers, what was it that they were trying to do? I mean, I agree. We overplay this in
Right.
convention, but what were the grievances, Daniel Shays and his contemporaries?
Sure. Well, the first thing I always have to say in framing this is that there was basically long story short, there was an economic crisis after the war, right? The country was laboring under very steep debts, but all of the states were laboring under those debts. And it was really only in Massachusetts that the government pushed the people to the verge of opposition. I'll just say resistance. And I do need to say clearly, this was not a violent movement. This was not an insurrection. It was nonviolent start to finish. Right. But so the grievances that they were protesting against, and that they started with petitions, years of petitions, a year and a half of petitions that were ignored. But the policies that they were rebelling against were basically that the government and James Bowdoin and wealthy merchants in the government were using the occasion of the post-war debts and using their fiscal policy to orchestrate a flagrantly unjust land grab. They were going to tax the farmers to pay the war debts in full. And when the farmers didn't have hard coin to pay those debts and taxes, they were going to lose their farms and their livestock, and they were going to be taken by the courts. And so people are going to be pushed off their farms. And then who's going to buy farms and livestock at auction, right? It's just going to be wealthy speculators who already have hard coin, specie money to buy with. So the fear, this is 10 years out from the revolution. Yul Brynner's son, wrote a very good dissertation on this episode and pointed out that there was a precedent, the 10 years of the interregnum in the 1600s. People look back in history and thought, well, maybe we had our 10 years. Right. And the oligarchy is going to take back over. The monarchy is going to resume us. And we're going to, the Scots-Irish farmers felt they were afraid of coming back under lordships. Right. They were just going to be pushed out and made tenants on their own land. And these were people who had fought a war to fight off the best army in the world. And they weren't going to let that happen. Yeah,
and they saw a system very much like that over in New York, where they did have the large proprietors with the holdings. It's interesting. A couple of years ago, I had a student from China who was visiting, and he had come here. He'd been here to study Shays' Rebellion, and they had learned about Shays' Rebellion. And the way it was just really struck me a difference, because in China, the lesson they had learned was the rebellion, bad thing, because the government represents the people. And as he went through James Bowdoin's papers and other papers at the Mass Historical Society, he came to see it in a different way, that maybe the rebels were right. So I wonder, here in America, we were born in a rebellion, a revolution. And there is certainly part of us that still celebrates that antipathy toward entrenched power. There isn't in China. And it just struck me. It's really an interesting parallel there. The way we teach it and the way we think about it, it is open to this really different, interesting interpretation. So you found that we're trying to get at the lived experience of Shays and these others, what it is they're opposing, and how they're crushed or how they are suppressed, and for various political ideological reasons.
Joe Ellis makes a fascinating point, I think, in the Founding Brothers, that America has two founding moments. There's the Declaration of Independence, which says we have the right, if not the moral obligation, to oppose unjust power. And then we have the Constitution, which says, here's the law of the land, and we're going to have to follow it, everybody. So these events, which the people called the regulation, they took the name of the regulators from events 15 years prior in North Carolina, where farmers in what was at the time the western frontier of North Carolina stood up against unjust bailiffs, unjust courts, unjust speculators and landowners who were trying to push them off of their farms and make them pay to buy farms that they had improved themselves. And the governor sent an army out, and there was a big shootout, and a whole bunch of people died. And this led to North Carolina and the South joining the revolution.
Right.
But one thing that I always want to make clear too is that the people in Massachusetts, at least, were calling in these protests. They didn't think they were doing anything unprecedented.
No.
They were doing something that was directly in line with a long line back to England,
right,
history of nonviolent theatrical street protest.
Yes.
To show the general populace, right? Like, this is explicitly not like an issue to try to control a particular set of resources or territories with military use. This was like back and forth, trying to get access to the hearts and minds of the countrymen, trying to this like PR battle.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So there was, again, nonviolent start to finish, but they had this tradition of showing that the government was out of line. The government's not respecting our needs, and we have to correct the government, which I think is, a great legacy to still be celebrating.
It is. Yeah.
But they were doing it. And, in the modern interpretation, because that happened in that in-between period, you'll see people, loving Daniel Shays with the Gadsden flags and a lot of right-wing imagery on their pickup trucks. And you'll see people loving Daniel Shays with, resist on their Prius.
Sure. Yeah.
It's a very malleable story that kind of opens up to a lot of different interpretation. But the gist is the government is out of control, and it's up to us, the people, to stand up for that.
Right. We're talking with Daniel Bullen, author of Daniel Shays'sHonorable Rebellion. And so talking about theatrical street protests, of course, one of the guys really good at orchestrating that was Samuel Adams back in 1760 to 70. So what's his take on this as it's unfolding in Western Mass?
His legacy is so malleable as well. I think you see people claiming him from all over. I think that it's been a little bit debunked that he was kind of the mastermind of street violence. He strikes me as kind of a little bit more of an academic Republican who is advocating for, for kind of self-rule with Republican government. But after the first round of protests, and this is one of the things that I did that I don't think that the histories previous were their academic analyses of the history. And what I did was put everything on a timeline, kind of go through it as it happened and as it unfolded. So after the first protest in Northampton in August of 1786, James Bowdoin responds with a statement saying that the farmers have introduced riot, anarchy, and confusion into the state. This is a nonviolent protest.
Yeah.
This is the threat from the aristocrats in the East. And then there's 4 more protests. Worcester, Concord, Taunton, and in Great Barrington, they all closed their courts. And when that is finished, Samuel Adams issues a statement that's published in the papers. It was approved at a meeting at Faneuil Hall and then published in the Worcester paper, saying that it's one thing to rebel against a monarchy, but he who rebels against the laws of a republic ought to suffer death.
Wow.
Which that's a heavy statement.
Yeah.
So it starts to look a little bit like this is kind of a counter-revolutionary campaign run by government to inflame the people in order to say, hey, we're in charge now. Stay out of the public space, the public square. Like we'll take it from here. And if it's unjust, wait till the next election. That's something I also always need to mention because it's left out of a lot of the histories. Is the people won all of their calls for reforms. They won in a landslide election. Like the whole state of Massachusetts was just fed up with James Bowdoin's hardline policies. And increasing threats. By October, they're passing a riot act threatening to take people to Boston out of their country, imprison them for a year, whip them 39 times every 3 months, seize their land and property, and indemnify bailiffs and deputies against any liability if they kill or injure protesters.
Wow. So
for people, again, who had just turned against British rule because it was oppressive, I think there's a real tone deafness in the government's response to this. There was really almost no diplomacy.
No.
So just to return to your question about Samuel Adams, I think he helped precipitate this because there had been a previous disruption in Massachusetts and the western counties out here in Hampshire County. 1782, what's known as Ely's Rebellion, where people had kind of resented the aristocratic aspects of the 1780 Massachusetts Constitution. Samuel Ely led some protests against this, and there was a big disruption, and Samuel Adams came west and kind of conducted a listening tour to see what people were really feeling and see what really needed to happen. And as I understand it, he came back to Boston, and his report was, they're just bellyaching. Well, they're fine. There's prosperity out there. They're going to be okay. We don't need to listen to the farmers.
Right.
So by 1785, 1786, he's in James Bowdoin's ear. It was one of his chief advisors telling him, hey, we founded this republic and we're not going to let these people take it away. So there was kind of a big struggle over whose republic it was and whose war it was and whose victory it was.
Interesting. It's interesting. Now, what kind of reforms were they pushing, and what did they want to change in the state government, the Shaysites?
Sure. A lot of it gets fairly technical, which gets tricky to get into. To be honest, I tried to relegate that stuff as much to the footnotes as I could. There's a lot to do with currency policy, with paper money versus hard coin. There's quite a bit to do with tender laws and the ability to pay debts in goods as opposed to money. They in a lot of their petitions, called for moving the state capital to Worcester instead of Boston so that people could afford to be represented. They complained about the court fees, because when debts were taken to the court, the judges were adding, let's be honest, like really predatory fees on top of, I think a debt of more than £6, they would add £3 to the court fees.
Wow.
Right. And this is at a time when an average laborer is getting £15 pay a year. So they're going to add half again to the amount of the debt just to have it heard before the judge. There's also, again, I think it was either Rockbrinner or another fellow, Robert Fear, who wrote really great analyses of this, that there wasn't a good kind of centralized public sphere. This is a very distributed landscape in Hampshire and Berkshire counties, especially, where there wasn't a county administrative center. There wasn't a place to have complaints heard. A lot of these Scots-Irish farmers were very ornery and independent, and they were going to make their own determinations about things. So it was a little bit of a perfect storm. And then I think the only other precipitating factor was about, really the government was trying to centralize control over the courts, through the courts over the people. And the people were, on the local level, people could vote in their own town meetings. A lot of towns, all adult white men could vote. On the state level, that 1780 Constitution raised the requirements from £40, from £40 to £60 in order to vote in statewide elections. And that put a lot of people out of the system. And there was this tension between the state culture, the Commonwealth culture, and the local culture, where people were used to managing things for themselves. So, it really adds up to a little bit of a culture difference between, what's on the coast and it's very eastward, Atlantic facing. And then, from that perspective, the farmers were just backward, superstitious rubes. Right. So there's a real class difference.
Really is. It's an interesting thing. And of course we can see, all kinds of parallels and so on too. But it is a persistent thing. Now, so off in Europe, I know Abigail Adams, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson are also kind of watching this unfold. So what's the reaction from these characters to what's going on?
So the Daniel Shays'sHonorable Rebellion, my title comes from this quote from Thomas Jefferson saying, asking in a letter, have you ever seen a rebellion so honorably conducted? God forbid we should ever be 20 years without such a rebellion. And I think at that point you have to put rebellion in a kind of quotes, right? Because it was nonviolent start to finish. I'll say this, every time the people were organized and showed up to parade in front of a court and demonstrate to their townspeople and their countrymen that they were suffering under an injustice, they showed up with military, the drums, fife and drums, military order, uniforms if they had them, to show we're the people and we're suffering an injustice here. in Boston, of course, they see that happening and they think there are armed men at our courts with guns.
Yeah.
So you can see the framing, and you can see kind of the local thing being pulled apart and turned into this thing in the national narrative, where the elites and the merchants and the founding fathers are trying to use it for their to make their points. So Thomas Jefferson is saying things like, yeah, we should, the tree of liberty ought to be watered from time to time. Like we hear this. And again, you can hear that kind of Declaration of Independence type language in a Constitution era, when that kind of stuff is really not, it's not going to be welcomed in the same way. Like you can't turn against it. But I also, just to drag in the present moment briefly, I think a lot of the threat, what people are fighting over when they give this name Shays' Rebellion, what they're saying is that the farmers were planning to do a January 6th style insurrection. They wanted to overthrow the government. They had these caricatures of the farmers as lazy moochers who just wanted things for free, who were being turned against the government, and inspired by foreign emissaries. Right? It's a really similar parallel, caricature to what we see today. Whereas from the people's side, they had this long tradition.
Sure.
But we do have that other tradition. I mean, we've seen that tradition in the South with Reconstruction. Heather Cox Richardson did this. Stetson Kennedy did this. How the South won the war. They were going to negate federal elections. They were going to just do away with any centralized authority, and they were going to put their own people in place through violence if necessary. So that was the threat with these farmers. That's the propaganda, is that these farmers wanted to overthrow the government. They were angry about taxes and they wanted to do away with government.
But you have someone like Jefferson
calling on a caricature. Sorry, go ahead.
And then what happens to these guys? So in April of 1787, there's a state election, right? And so what happened in that?
Right. John Hancock basically came back into office or was voted back into office in a landslide, like 2-1, 3-1. The people were fed up with this hardline position he had taken. But this thing started in August. It went, nonviolent protests. I think 11 or 12 courts were closed. Really, no violence. 3 guys were arrested. One of them was cut up at the end of November. Job Shattuck was arrested in Groton, and when he resisted arrest, they slashed him behind the knee with one of Bowdoin's militiamen slashed him behind the knee and severed some tendons and crippled him. Still, the people kept the peace. In January, the government sends an army after the people. The people take gunfire or take cannon fire at the Springfield Armory at the end of January. They don't respond with violence. They run to cries of murder, murder. Because in this PR battle, the rule for this PR battle is whoever shoots loses.
Right.
Whoever has the blood, and this is kind of the way that the Boston Massacre worked. Whoever has the bloody shirt, wave in the marketplace, they win. Right, because the other side has lost their control. So the government's army just chased them around until they finally scattered them at the beginning of February. Daniel Shays goes to Vermont, which is still an independent republic, and everybody's kind of just going to wait it out until elections. And by summer, everything was settled, basically.
So let's just backtrack to the Springfield Armory and what actually was going on there. What's that whole piece? Or are they trying to seize the weapons at the Armory? What's going on in Springfield?
Sure. Well, so when Daniel Shays is marching up at the head of a column of 1,200 men from Ludlow, he is asked by some emissaries who come out from the Armory, from the arsenal, what do you want? And Daniel Shays says, we're here for barracks and stores. And when this emissary tells him and his leaders that the general there is going to fire if they don't back down, Daniel Shays says, and then one of his officers, kind of on a second interview when they're closer to the arsenal, the response they give is interesting. He said, "It's what we want. We're bring it, like fire on us. Let's see how that goes." So I think that scene at the Armory, at the Arsenal, what's now the Armory, that scene is how people justify calling this an insurrection. I don't buy it for a couple of reasons. When Daniel Shays, and again, to bring this back to the timeline, those arrest warrants were issued on January 10th with a proclamation telling the people of Massachusetts that this has to stop. This has to be put down. Daniel Shays and two other leaders call their men in, to gather, to prepare to go to Springfield. They gather on January 19th.
Mm-hmm.
On the 18th, Westfield General William Shepard occupies those grounds. The people had marched past these grounds a number of times in other protests, never looked at them, never made a step toward them. But the people gather on January 19th and they hang out. Right? It doesn't seem to me like people who are urgent to take arms to overthrow the government are just going to bide their time and let that army get closer. So when they finally did make their approach to Springfield, and it was a little botched because there were two other contingents that were supposed to come from west and north to meet Daniel Shays coming from the east. When they finally set out to go to Springfield, they did so because the army that the governor was sending west had just left Worcester on the 23rd. So you've got 3,000 soldiers coming west. And if they don't control those guns and that gunpowder and those provisions, those things are all going to be used against them. And so I think that was as I understand it, kind of a last ditch ploy to try to buy the last bit of time to show, hey, we're the people, we're suffering in indignity, we're suffering in injustice here. And this is our last attempt to control resources to drive a conversation toward pardons and reforms.
Okay.
And, when they approached, it's interesting to do this talk, like at the Armory, they have their seating is 8 across. And you can see when you've got that thing filled with people, you can see what 24 people looks like, right? But 3 men were killed immediately. 1 died later of his wounds, but 20 were in the road wounded.
Wow.
And they took grape shot, which, as I describe in the book, is iron balls bigger than thumb knuckles. They're a good size ball that comes spraying out of the cannon. And again, they retreated to cries of murder, murder. They didn't regroup. They didn't make a military approach. They didn't fire their guns. They retreated because they weren't going to. They'd all fought a war together. They had just gone through this, at these people's sides, right? The people inside the arsenal they had either fought or they were too young to fight.
Right.
But nobody had an interest in another civil war. But they also didn't have a stomach for the kind of injustice they were going to suffer if these policies were not addressed.
Right. So we're talking with Daniel Bullen, author of Daniel Shays'sHonorable Rebellion, an American Story. And so then there is the state election. Not only is Bowdoin trounced by Hancock, but it's actually the biggest change in a Massachusetts legislature there's ever been. Something like 3/4 of the members are turned out of office. Those who supported the policy.
Incumbents did not do well.
Yeah. So then what happens with the rebels? Do they pursue finding them guilty of treason? Are there trials for these people? What happens in the wake of?
Sure. Well, so this is to take a step back from this question just a little bit. This caused me a lot of problems in writing a people's history, right? Because I love the academic discussion about this and the history about this story, but I really told it as a lived experience that started in July and just went through till June. But a lot of the evidence that I might have used for this, if there were letters or correspondence organizing these marches or back and forth, I think a lot of that evidence would have gone up the chimney in the time after February when the people were scattered. James Bowdoin's Attorney General, Robert Treat Paine, went riding around the state bringing people to trial. He had hundreds of people in Berkshire, had hundreds of people in Hampshire, and they were convicting people in trials, punishing them to things like standing for an hour on the gallows with a noose around their neck, right? The traps could spring open, but that was their punishment. Some of them were fined. Daniel Shays and 300 followers became refugees in Vermont, petitioned Chittenden for asylum in Vermont, and Chittenden didn't want Vermont to be a political football between James Bowdoin and getting into the Union. And they issued an edict saying they can't stay, but they also didn't enforce it.
Okay.
So Daniel Shays and these men become these kind of landless, stateless individuals. They rode as far as Canada begging for asylum there. And Lord Dorchester, the Canadian governor there, said, "We're not. When your countrymen want to belong to the United Kingdom again, then we can talk. But I'm not getting involved at this level." So again, they turned them away, but they didn't capture them and send them back to Bowdoin either.
Mm-hmm.
So it ends with them being in this kind of stateless position. But really, there were two people who were ultimately hung for crimes committed during this period. And both of those people were in Berkshire County, and they were hung for the crime of looting. So there was a little bit of outlawry. After the movement collapsed, there was a little bit of outlawry, some selective fires, arson here and there. But really, I think the biggest thing that happened to the people was that there was a huge exodus from Massachusetts. Right? These convulsions just convinced people that it was going to be better to move in fall or winter, move west to New York or Pennsylvania or Ohio or north to Vermont than it was to stay here in Massachusetts and fight this government that was just it was coming after people and making life hard. So there were some towns, as I understand it, where there were not enough people left to hold town offices. Right?
Wow.
Massachusetts just cleared out, but then you get the same, so one of the things that these protests led to is the 1787 land ordinance, right? That's going to allow new states to come in, territories to become states in the Union, because there were a lot of problems with these gray areas. We saw this in Vermont with the Wentworth grants, right? They had dual claims between New Hampshire and New York, and the Green Mountain Boys in the middle fighting it out. So I think that was part of the movement of the federal government taking a stance to kind of normalize these things and keep it less predatory. But you can see the engine, you can see the wave of colonization driving people to the settlements, because it just wasn't worth it to stay and fight here. The government was so rough on the people.
Very interesting. Thank you. We've been talking with Daniel Bullen, author of Daniel Shays'sHonorable Rebellion, an American Story. We've covered a lot of ground. Any other issues we should talk about that come up in 1787, 86, 87 with the Shaysites? Is it right to call them Shaysites, or should we call them?
Yeah, I like calling them the people.
Okay.
They call themselves the regulators, kind of taking that line.
Yeah.
I'll close with this anecdote. There was, in mid-September, the people, this is the last of the first round of protests, was out in Great Barrington, and Colonel Ashley raised 1,000 men in the militia to go out and open this court. By God, right? Yeah. So he marches into town with these 1,000 militiamen, and one of the judges comes out from the court and says, hold on. Whose law are we here enforcing anyway? If you're on the government side over here, if you're on the people's side over here. And when those 1,000 men separated themselves out, 800 of them were taking the people's side of the road.
Oh, interesting.
Right? So it really seems to me that the people knew whose law they were there to enforce. That just wasn't going to sit well with the powers in Boston. So I think maybe I'll close with this little gem, that I think that the actual title for these events shouldn't have anything to do with Daniel Shays. It should be Governor Bowdoin's flagrant land grab and counter-revolutionary panic, because again, all the other states were having these, the same economic condition, but in Massachusetts, they found it politically useful to kind of whip this thing up and let it spill over into reforms on a national level. So I'm delighted to tell the people's story, because they kept the peace, like start to finish.
Very good. Well, thank you, Dan, for sharing it. We've been talking with Dan Bullen, author of Daniel Shays'sHonorable Rebellion, and given us a lot to think about. It's available from Westholme Press, and we look forward to hearing more from you. And I want to thank you for joining us. And thanks to Jonathan Lane, our producer, and to our listeners all around the world. We have, when initially we thought we'd have a handful of folks in and around Boston listening, but we actually have folks all over the world. And now I want to invite you, if you're one of the listeners, to send an email to Jonathan. Every week I acknowledge folks in different parts of the world who listen to our podcast, and write to Jonathan Lane, jlane@masshist.org, and tell him you are from one of these places, and he will send you a Revolution 250 lapel pin, which you can wear proudly and be part of the Revolution 250 community. So I want to thank this week friends in Davenport, Illinois, in Ayer, Massachusetts, and if you're in Ayer, you know how that is, Ayer, Ahmedabad in Gujarat, and in Neptune City, New Jersey. So contact Jonathan Lane. I want to thank everyone else for joining us, and thank Dan Bullen for joining us and for writing the book about Daniel Shays'sHonorable Rebellion. And now we will be piped out on the road to Boston.
Thanks again.
Thanks.